Welcome back, folks. In this lecture, now that you really understand muscle contraction and all the moving parts and the basic physiology, let's dive into more microscopic stuff and talk and more chemistry related stuff and talk about muscle metabolism. How is it we get the energy to move muscles, and does it change between doing really quick activities versus being able to do something long term? Bottom line, yes, it does. So when we are talking long-term energy, what we are normally talking about is aerobic cellular respiration, where we are going to have carbohydrates enter through glycolysis, where we have pyruvic acid, then we add we end up with acetyl-CoA, and from there we can enter the Krebs cycle and then move on to oxidative phosphorylation or electron transfer chain. In addition, moving into the mitochondria, we could have breakdown products of lipids, the fatty acids enter. We also could have breakdown products of proteins, amino acids enter. The net result in a perfect world, if we start with a glucose molecule and everything works perfectly, we could end up with about 36 to 38 ATP. And we can constantly create this as long as we have oxygen and that glucose source, so we can continue with muscle metabolism for hours. Short-term energy refers to about the first minute, okay? And for this, it does not require any oxygen. So what we are relying on here is glucose from glycogen breakdown, and we are talking about glycogen, where we end up with that pyruvic acid, which then goes and forms lactic acid in the human. So sometimes it's called the glycogen lactate system. For us, you can just stick with glycolysis because you know that word from before. And remember, even though we start with 1 6-carbon sugars and we make 2 carbon sugars, so we make 4 ATP, it requires 2 ATP in order to break that 6-carbon sugar, so you end up with a net of only 2 ATP at the end of glycolysis. And then the third type of energy is immediate energy, which is only a couple seconds worth. Once again, it's not going to require oxygen, but it involves 3 different enzymes. And one we've alluded to before, but haven't really talked about the specific, and the other 2 I think are kind of new. So we are just talking the first few seconds, so under 15 seconds worth, but typically usually 5 to 10 seconds worth of energy. So let me talk about these 3 enzymes first, the atpase, the myokinase, and the creatine kinase. So atpase is the one enzyme that we have talked about before, because we've talked about how the head of the myosin has a binding site for ATP, and it has a binding site for actin, and then it has a place for the atpase enzyme, which can break down ATP. So that's what atpase does. When you have an ATP molecule, the ATPase will add hydrogen to it, it'll hydrolyze it, and you will end up with the lower energy ADP, an inorganic phosphate which can be released, and your energy which can be used for movement. So this enzyme, this reaction going from ATP to the ADP and the inorganic phosphate, that's called ATP hydrolysis or hydrolysis, because we are using the hydrogen and the hydroxyl and attaching that to the newly created molecules. So the second enzyme, and this gives you about a couple of seconds worth of energy, okay? We already have the ATP in the skeletal muscles being used all the time. As long as you have blood flow going on, and as long as you're breathing, you're making ATP. So we have a couple seconds worth. So like if you're on the treadmill and you're on the elliptical, it's good for maybe 2 or 3 steps, and that's it. The second enzyme is called myokinase. Now, some books call it adenylate kinase. And kinase means that phosphorylase, but I don't like to go with the adenylate kinase because then students get confused with adenylate cyclase, which is the enzyme we talked about when we talked about G proteins making cyclic AMP. So I'm just going to stick with the word myokinase, where the name is telling you muscles and we're moving phosphates around. So, because kinases, they all transfer phosphates. And so here's how myokinase works. We have two ADP. So each ADP has two phosphates on them. So this has more energy than an AMP, but not as much energy as an ATP. So what myokinase does is it takes these two ADPs and it transfers one phosphate so that you end up with an ATP and an AMP. Okay, so now we have an ATP that can be broken down by ATPase to give us that big burst of energies. And so this gives us a few more seconds of energy. And the third enzyme I will get to shortly, but in order to understand how it's going to help us, I have to talk about a molecule called creatine phosphate. So maybe some of you have been to the gym, you've seen the big bottles of creatine, like $10, and then you can go work out for hours instead. And so like you've been tempted by some trainers to spend your money on this. So let me tell you a little bit about creatine and creatine phosphate. So as I said before, ATP is constantly being made, even while you're sleeping. Well, obviously you're not running in your sleep, so you don't need all that ATP you're making. So what happens is that extra ATP that you're making when the muscles that are resting will then combine with an enzyme to form creatine and form creatine phosphate. So that extra energy is being stored in the creatine phosphate, and then you have the lower energy ADP off to the side, okay? And so now we can store creatine phosphate. And we're going to use the third enzyme, which is creatine kinase, to transfer phosphates. Now, interestingly, it's the same enzyme that's transferring the phosphate to form the creatine phosphate. But when we're exercising, we are starting with the creatine phosphate and the ADP, and we're going to use the creatine kinase to take a phosphate off the creatine phosphate so you end up with creatine, and dump that extra phosphate and its energy onto the ATP. So now we have a high energy ATP molecule. So there's one ATP that can be produced per creatine phosphate. Okay. And this will give us an additional 10, maybe 15 seconds worth of energy. And this only occurs in skeletal muscle, not happening anywhere else in the body. So at rest, creatine will bind with ATP to form creatine phosphate and an ADP molecule. Yes, that requires creatine kinase. But then in exercise, the creatine phosphate with the creatine kinase will regenerate the creatine molecule and give us ATP. So at rest, we're using the enzyme to make creatine phosphate, and at exercise, we're using the enzyme to form creatine. All right, so now we have our three enzymes. So all three of those enzymes are involved with transferring phosphate molecules. And so these are called the phosphagen system. Okay, because they're generating these high energy ATPs for an immediate supply of ATP. None of these are dependent on oxygen whatsoever. So this phosphagen system is what is used for immediate ATP. Once all three of these are gone, then we have to revert to our short-term energy supply, which is our glycolysis with the anaerobic fermentation giving us lactic acid. Once short-term energy supplies are gone, and by the way, that did not require any oxygen, short-term energy. So once that is gone, we must have oxygen. Our only choice of energy at this point is going to use long-term energy where we are going to be involving the mitochondria, Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation. And in a perfect world, and starting with the glucose molecule, ending up with 36 to 38 ATP. And this is the system that can provide us hours of energy. So if we look at it on a time graph, and as far as which pathway we are using, we're going to start here at time 0. The first one that we have in greatest supply that we use up in the first 2 seconds. So 1, 2 steps, and it's gone. And that is the ATP supply in your body. But then you go, oh, Dr. Powell, I've been taking my creatine, so let's involve that creatine phosphate system. And we can keep on going for 10 seconds. And then that system's gone. And then after that, the next system we are starting to use as these other systems are going lower and lower, we're going to use our glycolysis. And now we have gotten up to a minute. So when you start exercising, it is not ridiculous to feel like after about 30 to 60 seconds, it's like, man, this is really hard. I don't understand how I could be on this elliptical for 2 hours last week, but now today it's like 60 seconds and I'm ready to call it in, but I'm too embarrassed. I don't want anybody to see me quitting after a minute. So I'll just slog through it. Maybe I'll quit after 10 minutes and just figure out, pretend it was a warm up. But what happens after a couple of minutes, what has happened is you have flipped over to the aerobic system, which now will continue for hours. So yes, you can continue on with your normal exercise and not be embarrassed. So looking at these 3 systems, immediately we are using the phosphagen system with those 3 enzymes, the atpase, breaking down the ATP, the myokinase, which is forming ATP from 2 ADPs, and then the glycolytic lactate system, which is using glycolysis. Okay, so, the third enzyme was the creatine phosphate, the creatine kinase. So taking the creatine phosphate to make ATP. So that's the green, the phosphagen system. As that is being used up, you are transitioning to glycolysis, which is the blue line. And as that starts going down, by then you have warmed up, you have increased blood supply, you have more oxygen, you are breathing, not holding your breath, and you are going to go into cellular respiration, oxidative phosphorylation, which will take you throughout the entire length of your workout. You probably have all seen very fine-tuned athletes, for instance, running marathons, and then they can be 50, 100 yards from the end, and they have hit the wall. Okay? From prolonged use of the muscles can become weak, and you develop what is called muscle fatigue, and there's a lot of chemistry involved in this. So pause it at this and kind of go through all these one by one so you understand why this happens, especially if you're going into kinesiology or physical therapy. But basically what happens is we're using up our ATP, and so our ADP levels are getting higher than our ATP levels. And as we are consuming our storage of glycogen, the marathoners and the ultra marathoners, they're using up their total glycogen stores. And so they're not able to make any more ATP. And as your ATP production goes down, then your sodium potassium pump slows down, which means sodium is not outside the cell, it's inside the cell, which means you are not going to be able to depolarize. In addition, if you are relying more on glycolysis because you don't have oxygen anymore, that lactic acid decreases the pH, which then will inhibit the enzymes. So the enzymes to form more ATP aren't going to work. So go through the rest of these. The net result of all of these is that you will end up with weak contractions, if any, and your muscles are in what's called oxygen debt, okay? Because the muscles, when they're exercising, are requiring a certain amount of oxygen. So let me explain to you what oxygen debt is. At rest, you have a certain amount of oxygen that your muscles need in order for their normal metabolic activities. Once you start exercising, that oxygen requirement skyrockets, and that's what this green line is. And while you are at a steady level of exercise, you will have this steady level. And if you're doing like sprint intervals, it'll go up and then it goes back down in your interval time. But just say you're doing a steady 5-mile run. At the end of the run, if you are young and naive, or like some of my children where you're done exercising and you're told, okay, go cool off, you go, I ain't cool. Okay. What happens then is your muscles needed this high level of oxygen, only you have quit exercising. So the amount of blood coming in to bring the oxygen is here. And so you end up with this blue area right here at the end, which is called oxygen debt. It's the extra amount of oxygen that must be supplied after exercise ends in order to restore the metabolism to where it was before exercise. In other words, after exercise, post-exercise, your oxygen consumption does not go down to where it was pre-exercise immediately. It slowly will work its way back down, but you have to give it more oxygen to get it back to where it was during your recovery. So let's put everything together we've talked about. Why do we stretch? Why do we warm up? Why do we cool down? If you recall, the twitches vary with muscle temperature. We talked about the Treppe staircase effect. So if you have warmed up your muscle, it's going to contract more strongly because those enzymes can work more quickly. Okay. And then post-exercise, that cool down period is to allow higher blood flow into the muscle more than what you are exercising so that you have a faster reversal of your oxygen debt. And here is a final slide, which is pretty much bringing together all the concepts of muscle physiology we've talked about before. So definitely pause at this one and go through them step by step to make sure you got these concepts previously when I said so. Pause and make sure you get this before you move on, because here they are all listed. All of these will affect your muscle strength, not just muscle fatigue, not just any one thing, but all of these affect your muscle strength. And with that, I am done with this section, and I will see you shortly as we continue on with our muscle physiology. Thank you for all your hard work, especially focusing on this muscle